Essentially, all of the uranium exported from South Australia contributes to reactor risk around the world, and it always ends up as untenable nuclear waste, a hazard to some other communities across the globe. But it also contributes directly to the production of plutonium. South Australian uranium used in nuclear reactors produces plutonium, and often that plutonium is isolated through the reprocessing cycle to a very large constituents. Now, some half of the world's plutonium has been produced in civilian power reactors and has been isolated through the reprocessing industry. And that plutonium then is a perpetual hazard to health and environment around the globe. Governments claim that they flag uranium for peaceful purposes, so Australia will export uranium to overseas powers that claim that they'll put this pile of uranium together, put an Australian flag on it, and they won't use that for military purposes. But equally, adjacent to that can be a pile of uranium that's not flagged for peaceful purposes, and one can't tell the difference between the two materials. And when a foreign power or other uses plutonium for one cycle or the other, it really is not a great deal of difference between the two arms of the industry, the civilian and the military. There are what are called nuclear cooperation treaties that Australia signs in terms of its uranium exports that state that Australia's uranium is not supposed to be used in the military cycle. Now, one key question for that, a more recent question, is whether Australian uranium has or could be used in depleted uranium around the world. And that is an issue that wasn't addressed in those treaties, and an issue that there aren't any formal guarantees on. Depleted uranium is a byproduct of the nuclear industry. When uranium is refined to make nuclear power for reactors, the main resulting waste is depleted uranium, uranium-238. Now, the military like that material because it's very heavy, and on impact in use in munitions and armaments, on impact with a vehicle or a tank, it basically is much more destructive than a conventional shell. What happens then, though, is that uranium is essentially, it burns in the explosion, and it's essentially powdered and has the opportunity to be dispersed and distributed and directly taken up inhaled by people in that environment where the war has occurred. It's essentially a perpetual risk because that depleted uranium-238, is a very long-lived isotope. So it's both a hazard in terms of heavy metal health issues, but also a radiological hazard. It's also been used in Afghanistan and more recently in Iraq, and that's an area that Australian troops, who in theory the Australian Army doesn't use depleted uranium munitions, but when Australian or other troops join the American Army in the field, the Americans very widely use depleted uranium, and potentially not just the military of the US, but the military of other countries, and certainly the civilian population and the environment are subject to contamination and radiological risk from depleted uranium. A high proportion of the depleted uranium used in munitions forms a very fine powder which can be dispersed by wind or by water. Often the regulators at a national level in Australia, a group called APANSA, the Australian Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Agency, they essentially facilitate the nuclear industry and often facilitate the expansion of the nuclear industry, and they're the least reliable people essentially to be setting the standards in terms of health exposure and radiation risk. South Australia bears the legacy of the British atomic bomb tests at Maralinga and Emu Field. And SA, as we understand it, is the only society that has ever provided uranium from its own land to a foreign nuclear weapons power to be made into weapons to then be bombed back on Australia. The uranium used from Mount Painter and from Radium Hill contributed to those British atomic bombs that were dropped on Australia at Emu Field and Maralinga. The nuclear industry expansion in Australia is heavily contested. Communities right up to state parliaments are passing laws against different aspects of this nuclear industry. From the communities in Sydney are opposing the reactor risk. Communities from Lucas Heights right through the Blue Mountains, Dubbo to Broken Hill are opposing the transport of the radioactive waste. Traditional owner communities particularly, are very strong in opposing uranium mining and nuclear dumping. The reactor in Sydney is to be twice the size of the existing Lucas Heights reactor. It does have potential for significant health impacts in a local area. It's a significant and a totally unnecessary potential terrorist target to have in Australia's largest city. There's no need to be having any new reactor in Sydney, let alone one being built in our largest city. There are alternatives to the production of medical isotopes through cyclotrons or through importing, which is the standard method for the key isotope technetium-99. Countries as developed as Japan and the United States don't use their own reactors to produce technetium-99, they import it from Canada. We could be importing that main isotope from Canada just as Japan and the United States does, instead of the huge opportunity cost in spending some up to $500 million on a new reactor in Sydney. Our society with limited resources could be so much better using that money on human rights, on environment, on health and safety, on new sustainable energy opportunities, rather than wasting it in a discredited and hazardous nuclear industry when there's no need for those reactors anymore. The international laws that were written to facilitate the nuclear industry, and the international agencies such as the International Atomic Energy Agency promote and facilitate the nuclear industry. It's for individual communities and countries individually to stand up and change those regimes. That the health impacts on individuals won't have been recognised or won't have been admitted to by government or by the industry, but a lot of people much of the environment will have paid a cost for that radiation exposure. But that's happened to so many countries around the world, and to so many traditional owner communities, that it's the land of traditional owners that's used by the nuclear industry for atomic bomb testing and for nuclear dumping. It's the civilian population that pay the price for all of the aerial atomic bomb tests over time. It's the community that pays the price, that opportunity cost of so much investment going into a hazardous toxic nuclear industry, and then leaving those same communities to answer the question of how they will in perpetuity manage the nuclear waste. Australia became very well aware of that when a group called Pangaea, with particular support from British Nuclear Fuels, put a proposal for a geological burial site for some 20%, they had hoped, of the world's high-level nuclear waste in Western Australia or in South Australia. And the Australian community again reacted to that, and the Western Australian Parliament made that illegal in 1999, and the South Australian Parliament made that illegal in 2000. So communities right across the country have reacted against that nuclear waste legacy from overseas being brought to Australia. We've now got to become mature enough to close the cycle and cut off, to take the moral issue of stopping uranium production in Australia that contributes to that nuclear waste production around the world.